In the grand ballrooms of Regency England, where titles meant everything, and scandal could destroy a lifetime, Duke Reginald Ashworth believed his name alone could conquer any heart. But on a moonlit terrace in Bath, his new bride would speak words that would shatter his arrogance forever. What truth could a gentlewoman possess that would bring the mighty Duke to his knees? The answer would change everything he thought he knew about power, love, and the price of pride. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning mist clung to the manicured gardens of Ashworth Manor like a shroud of secrets, and Lady Evangeline Fairfax pressed her pale fingers against the cold window pane of her chamber, watching the groundskeepers tend to roses that would never know freedom from their carefully planned beds. At 19, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that poets wrote about. Auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper, eyes the color of spring violets, and a delicate frame that seemed almost too fragile for the weight of expectations placed upon her slender shoulders. "The Duke shall arrive within the hour," announced her governess, Mrs. Pemberton, bustling into the room with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing the lives of others. "Your father expects you in the drawing-room, properly attired and prepared to receive your betrothed with appropriate gratitude." Evangeline's reflection stared back at her from the window, a young woman trapped between duty and desire, between the life chosen for her and the dreams she dared not speak aloud. The arrangement had been settled when she was merely 16, a business transaction disguised as romance between her father, Earl Fairfax, and the powerful Ashworth family. Duke Reginald Ashworth, at 32, was considered the most eligible bachelor in all of England, his wealth rivaling that of minor royalty, his influence extending from London's political circles to the furthest reaches of his vast estates. "Tell me, Mrs. Pemberton," Evangeline said softly, her breath fogging the glass, "do you believe love can grow where it was never planted?" The older woman paused in her arrangement of Evangeline's jewelry, her weathered hands stilling over the sapphire necklace that had belonged to 3 generations of Fairfax brides. "My dear child, love is a luxury that women of your station can rarely afford. Respect, security, and the continuation of noble bloodlines, these are the foundations upon which lasting marriages are built." But Evangeline had read the letters her grandmother had hidden away, passionate correspondence between her grandparents that spoke of hearts racing at the mere sight of beloved handwriting, of stolen moments in moonlit gardens, of a love so fierce it had weathered decades of joy and sorrow. She longed for such connection, for someone who would see beyond her title and dowry to the woman who dreamed of traveling to distant lands, who secretly devoured books on natural philosophy, who wondered what it might feel like to choose her own destiny. The sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones announced the Duke's arrival, and Evangeline's heart began to race, not with anticipation, but with a growing sense of dread that had haunted her for months. During their brief, chaperoned encounters, Duke Reginald had displayed all the proper courtesies, yet something in his steel-grey eyes had always made her feel more like a prized acquisition than a cherished bride-to-be. He spoke of their future with the same tone he might use to discuss the purchase of a thoroughbred horse, calculating, possessive, utterly devoid of warmth. "Remember, Mrs. Pemberton whispered as she fastened the sapphire necklace around Evangeline's throat, the cold stones feeling like shackles against her skin. "You are a Fairfax, dignity and grace, regardless of your personal feelings." As Evangeline descended the grand staircase, her silk gown rustling against the marble steps, she could hear her father's booming laughter echoing from the drawing-room, punctuated by the Duke's deeper, more measured tones. The 2 men were discussing her as if she were not a person, but a commodity, their conversation peppered with references to bloodlines, property consolidation, and the advantageous merger of their estates. "Ah, here she is!" Earl Fairfax announced as Evangeline entered the opulent room, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch her with disapproving eyes. "Evangeline, my dear, come greet your future husband." Duke Reginald Ashworth rose from his chair with practiced elegance, his tall frame impeccably dressed in a midnight blue coat that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding presence. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his features sharp and aristocratic, and when he smiled, it was the kind of expression that never quite reached his eyes. He was undeniably handsome in the way that powerful men often were, but Evangeline felt no flutter of attraction, no spark of connection, only the cold recognition of a man who viewed her as another possession to be acquired and displayed. "Lady Evangeline," he said, taking her gloved hand and pressing it to his lips in a gesture that felt more like a claim of ownership than a romantic greeting. "You look radiant, as always. I trust you are prepared for our wedding next month. I have already made arrangements for our honeymoon journey to my estate in the Lake District. The isolation will provide us with ample opportunity to become better acquainted." Something in his tone made Evangeline's skin crawl, though she could not quite articulate why. She curtsied gracefully, her training taking over where her courage failed. "I am honored by your attention, Your Grace." Excellent," her father interjected, rubbing his hands together with barely concealed glee. "The contracts have been finalized, the settlements agreed upon. This union will secure both our families' futures for generations to come." As the men continued their discussion of financial arrangements and social advantages, Evangeline found herself studying the Duke's profile, searching for any hint of the man who would soon have complete authority over her life, her body, her very existence. What she saw chilled her to the bone. A cold calculation in his gaze, a sense of entitlement that seemed to permeate his every gesture, and beneath his polished exterior, something that whispered of cruelty, carefully concealed. But what terrified her most was the growing certainty that Duke Reginald Ashworth harbored secrets far darker than mere arrogance, and that her wedding day would mark not the beginning of her happiness, but the end of everything she had ever hoped to become. The morning of her wedding dawned with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through the very stones of St. George's Cathedral, where England's most distinguished families had gathered to witness what society proclaimed would be the union of the decade. Evangeline sat before her dressing table in the bridal chambers, her reflection pale as moonlight against the ivory silk of her wedding gown, a masterpiece of French craftsmanship that had taken 6 seamstresses 3 months to complete. The dress featured intricate pearl beadwork that caught the candlelight like captured stars, and a train so elaborate it required 2 attendants to manage its graceful flow. "You look like an angel descended from heaven itself," whispered her cousin Charlotte, who served as her maid of honor. Charlotte Pembroke was everything Evangeline was not, bold where Evangeline was gentle, calculating where Evangeline was sincere, ambitious where Evangeline was content with simplicity. At 21, Charlotte possessed a sharp beauty that commanded attention, with raven black hair and emerald eyes that seemed to catalogue every advantage and opportunity within her reach. "I feel more like a lamb being led to slaughter," Evangeline murmured, her fingers trembling as she attempted to fasten her grandmother's pearl earrings. The weight of tradition pressed down upon her shoulders like a physical burden. Generations of Fairfax women who had walked this same path, who had sacrificed their dreams upon the altar of duty and social expectation. Through the tall windows of the cathedral's bridal chamber, Evangeline could see the endless stream of carriages arriving, disgorging London's elite in their finest attire. The Duke's own family occupied the front pews, his stern mother, the Dowager Duchess, whose disapproving gaze could wither flowers at 20 paces, and his younger brother Lord Marcus, whose reputation for gambling and debauchery was whispered about in drawing rooms across the city. "The Duke has arrived," announced Mrs. Pemberton, her voice tight with nervous energy. "The ceremony shall commence within the quarter hour. Lady Evangeline, it is time." And as Evangeline rose from her chair, the cathedral bells began their triumphant peal, their bronze voices carrying across London's rooftops to announce that one of England's most powerful men was about to claim his bride. The sound should have filled her with joy, but instead it felt like a funeral dirge for the woman she might have been. The processional began with Charlotte gliding down the aisle in her gown of deep rose silk, followed by the younger bridesmaids, daughters of earls and viscounts, who giggled behind their fans and cast admiring glances at the assembled gentlemen. Then came the moment Evangeline had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. The great doors of the cathedral opened, and she stepped into view of the hundreds of guests who had come to witness her transformation from Lady Evangeline Fairfax into the Duchess of Ashworth. The cathedral was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, its soaring arches and stained glass windows creating an atmosphere of divine majesty. Thousands of white roses and orange blossoms adorned every surface, their perfume mingling with the incense to create an almost intoxicating fragrance. Candlelight flickered from countless silver candelabras, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled nobility. Duke Reginald stood at the altar in his formal military dress uniform, the deep blue fabric adorned with gold braiding and medals that spoke of his service to the crown. He was undeniably magnificent, a figure of power and authority that commanded respect from every person in the cathedral. Yet as Evangeline walked toward him on her father's arm, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The Duke's attention was not focused on his approaching bride, but rather on Charlotte, who had taken her place at the altar with a smile that seemed far too knowing, far too intimate. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself had been commissioned to perform the ceremony, his ancient voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition as he began the sacred words that would bind Evangeline's fate forever. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." But as the ceremony progressed, Evangeline became increasingly aware of subtle exchanges between the Duke and Charlotte. Meaningful glances, barely perceptible nods, a shared understanding that excluded everyone else in the cathedral. Her cousin's position as maid of honor placed her directly in the Duke's line of sight, and Evangeline watched with growing horror as Charlotte's fingers traced the edge of her bouquet in what appeared to be some sort of signal. "If any person can show just cause why these two should not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace," intoned the Archbishop, his words echoing through the vast space. The silence that followed was supposed to be ceremonial, a mere formality before the final vows were exchanged. But instead of the expected quiet, Duke Reginald cleared his throat and stepped back from Evangeline, his face a mask of cold determination. "I cannot proceed with this ceremony," he announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the cathedral. A collective gasp arose from the assembled guests, followed by a silence so complete that the sound of a dropped prayer book seemed to thunder through the sacred space. Evangeline felt the world tilt beneath her feet, her vision blurring as the Duke's words registered in her mind. "Your Grace?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the shocked murmurs beginning to ripple through the congregation. "I have discovered," the Duke continued, his tone as formal and emotionless as if he were reading a legal document, "that my heart belongs to another. I cannot in good conscience pledge my life to Lady Evangeline when my affections lie elsewhere." The cathedral erupted into chaos. Ladies fanned themselves frantically, while gentlemen rose from their seats, their voices creating a cacophony of shock and speculation. Evangeline's father stepped forward, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "What is the meaning of this outrage? The contracts are signed, the settlements agreed upon." Duke Reginald's smile was as sharp as a blade. "Contracts can be broken, Earl Fairfax. especially when one discovers that true love cannot be denied. He turned toward Charlotte, extending his hand with theatrical gallantry. "Miss Pembroke has agreed to become my wife. We shall be married within the month." Charlotte stepped forward, her emerald eyes glittering with triumph as she placed her hand in the Duke's. "Forgive me, cousin," she said to Evangeline, though her tone held no trace of remorse. "But surely you would not wish me to deny my heart's true calling. The Duke and I have discovered a connection that transcends mere social arrangement." The betrayal hit Evangeline like a physical blow. Her own cousin, the woman who had helped her dress, who had shared her secrets, who had comforted her fears about marriage, had been conducting a clandestine affair with her betrothed. The elaborate wedding, the months of preparation, the dreams she had tried so hard to nurture despite her reservations, all of it had been nothing more than an elaborate charade. "You planned this," Evangeline said, her voice growing stronger as the full scope of their deception became clear. "Both of you. This entire spectacle was designed to humiliate me publicly." Duke Reginald's laugh was cold and mirthless. "My dear Lady Evangeline, surely you did not believe that a man of my stature would be content with such a timid creature as yourself. Charlotte possesses the fire and ambition that befits a duchess. You are better suited to a quiet life of spinsterhood, perhaps tending to your books and your charitable works." The cruelty of his words, delivered before hundreds of England's most influential citizens, was breathtaking in its calculated malice. Evangeline realized that this public rejection was not merely about the Duke's supposed love for Charlotte. It was a deliberate act of social destruction, designed to ensure that she would never recover from the shame, never find another suitable husband, never pose any threat to their happiness. "The Duke speaks truly," Charlotte added, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. "Some women are born to be wives and mothers, while others are destined for lesser roles. Surely, cousin, you must see that this arrangement benefits everyone involved." Evangeline stood frozen at the altar, her wedding gown suddenly feeling like a costume in a cruel theatrical performance. The hundreds of guests stared at her with a mixture of pity, shock, and barely concealed fascination. She had become the spectacle of the season, the cautionary tale that would be whispered about in drawing rooms for years to come. But as she looked into Charlotte's triumphant face and saw the Duke's cold satisfaction, something unexpected stirred within Evangeline's chest. Not the crushing despair she might have expected, but a spark of something fiercer, a recognition that she had been underestimated by people who mistook gentleness for weakness, kindness for stupidity. "You are quite right, Your Grace," Evangeline said, her voice carrying with surprising clarity through the cathedral. "This arrangement does indeed benefit everyone involved. Most particularly, it has revealed the true character of those I mistakenly considered worthy of my respect." With that, she gathered her elaborate train in her hands and walked with perfect dignity down the aisle, past the shocked faces of London's elite, past her mortified father, past the whispered speculations and barely concealed excitement of those who had just witnessed the social scandal of the decade. But as Evangeline reached the cathedral doors, she could not have known that this moment of public humiliation would prove to be not the end of her story, but the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately lead her to a happiness far greater than anything she could have found in the golden cage of the Duke's cold ambition. What refuge could possibly exist for a woman so publicly shamed, and what unexpected allies might emerge from the ashes of her destroyed reputation? The carriage wheels clattered against the cobblestones of Bath's elegant crescents as Evangeline pressed her face to the rain-streaked window, watching the honey-coloured Georgian terraces blur past through her tears. 3 weeks had passed since the cathedral humiliation. 3 weeks during which London society had feasted upon every detail of her public rejection, like vultures picking clean a carcass. The scandal sheets had been merciless, dubbing her the discarded Duchess, and speculating endlessly about what fatal flaw had driven the Duke to such dramatic action. Her father had barely spoken to her during the journey from London, his face a mask of barely controlled fury at the financial and social catastrophe that had befallen the Fairfax name. The wedding gifts had to be returned, the settlements renegotiated, and worst of all, the whispered speculation about what deficiency in his daughter had caused such a spectacular rejection. Earl Fairfax was a man who measured his worth by his social standing, and Evangeline's disgrace had tarnished his reputation in ways that might take years to repair. "We have arrived at Royal Crescent," announced the coachman, his voice barely audible above the autumn rain that had been falling steadily since they left London. Evangeline gathered her dark travelling cloak around her shoulders and stepped down from the carriage, her boots splashing in the puddles that reflected the grey sky like mirrors of her own melancholy. Number 16, Royal Crescent, stood before her like a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. The elegant townhouse belonged to her great-aunt Agatha Worthington, her grandmother's younger sister, who had scandalized society 30 years earlier by refusing 3 perfectly suitable marriage proposals and instead choosing to live as an independent woman of letters. Aunt Agatha had travelled extensively, written several books on natural philosophy under a masculine pseudonym, and maintained a salon that attracted some of the most brilliant minds in England. The door opened before Evangeline could lift the brass knocker, revealing a woman of 65 whose silver hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure that somehow managed to look both fashionable and slightly rebellious. Aunt Agatha possessed the kind of beauty that improved with age: sharp cheekbones, intelligent grey eyes, and a bearing that spoke of absolute confidence in her own worth. She wore a gown of deep purple silk that would have been considered too bold for a woman of her years, yet on her it looked perfectly appropriate. "My dear child," Aunt Agatha said, her voice warm with genuine affection as she drew Evangeline into an embrace that smelled of lavender and old books. "Come in from this dreadful weather. Mrs. Hartwell has prepared your favourite chambers, and I've had cook make that ginger cake you loved so much as a child." The interior of the townhouse was a revelation. Walls lined with books in multiple languages, artifacts from distant travels displayed alongside scientific instruments, and paintings that depicted not noble ancestors but exotic landscapes and foreign cities. It was a home that spoke of a life lived on one's own terms, and for the first time in weeks, Evangeline felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I suppose you've heard," Evangeline said quietly as they settled in the drawing-room, where a cheerful fire crackled in the grate, and tea had been laid out on a table inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "My dear girl, all of England has heard," Aunt Agatha replied with characteristic directness. "The question is not what happened, but what you intend to do about it. Will you allow this setback to define you, or will you use it as an opportunity to discover who you truly are when freed from society's expectations?" Evangeline stared into her teacup, watching the steam rise like incense. "I feel as though I've been sleepwalking through my entire life, Aunt Agatha. Everything was planned for me: my education, my accomplishments, my marriage. I never questioned whether any of it was what I actually wanted. And now," Aunt Agatha prompted, her intelligent eyes studying her great niece, with the intensity of a natural philosopher examining a fascinating specimen. "Now I find myself terrified by the freedom," Evangeline admitted. "What does a woman do when she has no predetermined path to follow? I have no skills beyond those deemed appropriate for a duke's wife: a little French, a little piano, enough knowledge of household management to oversee servants. I am utterly unprepared for independence." Aunt Agatha's laugh was rich and knowing. "My dear child, you underestimate yourself dramatically. Do you think I was born knowing how to navigate the world as an unmarried woman? Independence is a skill like any other. It must be learned, practiced, and refined. And you have advantages that many women lack: intelligence, education, and most importantly, the financial means to choose your own course." Over the following days, Evangeline began to discover a different rhythm of life. Aunt Agatha's household operated according to principles of intellectual curiosity rather than social obligation. Breakfast conversations might range from the latest archaeological discoveries in Egypt to debates about women's education, and the afternoon callers included not just society ladies, but also scholars, artists, and reformers who treated Evangeline's opinions as worthy of consideration. It was during one such afternoon gathering that Evangeline first encountered Dr. Elias Reed, a physician and natural philosopher who had recently returned from studying advanced medical techniques in Edinburgh. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark auburn hair that refused to stay properly arranged, and green eyes that seemed to see everything with scientific precision. Unlike the polished gentlemen of London society, Dr. Reed possessed an earnest intensity that spoke of a man more concerned with healing the sick than impressing the wealthy. "Lady Evangeline," Aunt Agatha said, drawing her forward as the small group gathered around the tea table, "allow me to present Dr. Reed. He has been telling us the most fascinating things about his work with the poor in Edinburgh's Old Town. Dr. Reed, my great-niece has recently come to stay with me, and I believe you might find her perspectives on social reform quite illuminating." Dr. Reed bowed politely, but when he straightened, his gaze met Evangeline's with a directness that was both refreshing and slightly unsettling. "Lady Evangeline, I confess I'm curious about your thoughts on the medical care available to women of different social classes. In my experience, the quality of treatment a woman receives often depends more upon her husband's wealth than her actual medical needs." The question caught Evangeline off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was the first time in her adult life that a gentleman had asked for her opinion on a matter of substance rather than her preferences in music or literature. I have often wondered about that very thing," she said slowly, her mind beginning to engage with ideas she had never been encouraged to explore. "During my charitable visits in London, I observed that the women in the workhouses seemed to suffer from ailments that were dismissed as hysteria or moral weakness, when perhaps they were actually symptoms of malnutrition or overwork." Dr. Reed's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Precisely. You have identified one of the most significant challenges in modern medicine, the tendency to attribute women's suffering to moral or emotional deficiencies rather than investigating the actual physical causes. Have you given thought to how such attitudes might be changed?" As the conversation continued, Evangeline found herself articulating ideas she had never dared voice before, thoughts that had been forming in the quiet corners of her mind during those long months of preparation for a marriage she had dreaded. Dr. Reed listened with the kind of attention she had never received from the Duke or any other gentleman of her acquaintance. Not the polite tolerance extended to a woman's chatter, but the genuine engagement of one intellectual with another. "Dr. Reed has established a small clinic in the poorer sections of Bath," Aunt Agatha mentioned as the afternoon drew to a close. "He provides medical care regardless of a patient's ability to pay, and he has been seeking volunteers to assist with basic care and education. Perhaps, Evangeline, you might find such work illuminating." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Evangeline had spent her entire life in drawing rooms and ballrooms, surrounded by luxury and insulated from the harsh realities that most people face daily. The idea of working directly with the poor, of using her hands for something more meaningful than embroidery, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I would be honored to assist," she heard herself saying, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. "Though I confess I have no experience with such work." "Experience can be gained," Dr. Reed replied, his smile transforming his serious face into something almost boyish. "What matters more is the willingness to learn and the desire to serve others. If you are truly interested, Lady Evangeline, I would welcome your assistance." As the weeks passed, Evangeline found herself settling into a routine that would have horrified her former self. 3 mornings a week, she accompanied Dr. Reed to his clinic in the narrow streets below Bath's elegant terraces, where she learned to change bandages, prepare simple medicines, and most importantly, to listen to the stories of women whose lives had been shaped by poverty, violence, and neglect. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking, but it awakened something in Evangeline that had been dormant throughout her privileged upbringing, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with social advancement or family honor. She discovered that she possessed a natural talent for comforting the frightened and organizing the chaotic, skills that had been dismissed as mere feminine instincts, but which proved invaluable in the clinic's demanding environment. "You have a gift for this work," Dr. Reed told her one afternoon as they walked back through Bath's winding streets after a particularly challenging day. The autumn light was fading, casting long shadows across the Georgian facades, and Evangeline felt a contentment she had never experienced in London's glittering ballrooms. "I never imagined that helping others could feel so fulfilling," she replied, pulling her cloak closer against the evening chill. "In London, my charitable work felt like performance, something done to demonstrate my virtue rather than to actually improve anyone's circumstances." "Perhaps," Dr. Reed said thoughtfully, "your recent experiences have freed you to discover what truly matters to you, rather than what others expect you to value." His words carried a weight that went beyond mere observation, and Evangeline found herself wondering if he understood more about her situation than she had revealed. There was something in his manner, a gentleness combined with strength, an intelligence that sought to understand rather than to impress, that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. But even as she began to find peace in her new life, Evangeline could not shake the feeling that her story with the Duke and Charlotte was far from over. Letters from London brought news of their hasty wedding, their lavish honeymoon, and their triumphant return to society as the season's most celebrated couple. Yet something in the tone of these reports suggested that all was not as perfect as it appeared, and Evangeline found herself wondering what secrets might lie beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect union. What she could not have anticipated was how soon those secrets would come to light, and how her own transformation would prepare her for a confrontation that would test everything she had learned about her own strength and worth. The invitation arrived on a crisp December morning, delivered by a liveried footman whose nervous demeanor suggested he understood the significance of his errand. Evangeline turned the heavy cream paper over in her hands, recognizing the Ashworth family crest embossed in gold. A lion rampant surrounded by oak leaves, symbols of power and endurance that now seemed almost mockingly appropriate. The Duke and his new Duchess were hosting their first major social event since their marriage, a grand Christmas ball at Ashworth Manor, with proceeds benefiting the local orphanage. "How deliciously ironic," Aunt Agatha observed, reading the invitation over Evangeline's shoulder as they sat in the morning room overlooking the frost-covered gardens of Royal Crescent. "They invite you to witness their triumph, while positioning themselves as paragons of charity. One might almost admire the audacity if it weren't so transparently calculated." Evangeline set the invitation aside with hands that trembled only slightly. 6 months had passed since that terrible morning in the cathedral, 6 months during which she had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her former life. The woman who had fled London in shame bore little resemblance to the confident, purposeful person she had become. Her work at Dr. Reed's clinic had given her a sense of worth that had nothing to do with social position, and her evenings spent in Aunt Agatha's salon had awakened an intellectual curiosity she had never been encouraged to explore. "I shall not attend, of course," Evangeline said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt a stirring of something that might have been defiance. What purpose would it serve except to provide entertainment for those who witnessed my humiliation? "My dear child," Aunt Agatha replied, settling into her favourite chair with the grace of a woman who had never doubted her own worth. "You speak as though you are still the same frightened girl who arrived on my doorstep. But look at yourself, truly look. You have spent these months discovering your own strength, your own purpose. Why should you hide that transformation from the world?" Dr. Reed arrived for their usual afternoon consultation just as Evangeline was composing her polite refusal to the Duke's invitation. Over the past months, their professional relationship had evolved into something deeper and more complex, a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Though Evangeline had begun to suspect that his feelings, like her own, might extend beyond mere collegial admiration. "You seem troubled today," he observed, his perceptive green eyes noting the tension in her posture as she sat at Aunt Agatha's writing desk. "Has something occurred to disturb your peace?" Evangeline handed him the invitation without comment, watching as his expression darkened while he read. Dr. Reed had heard the full story of her humiliation, not from gossip, but from Evangeline herself during one of their long conversations about the ways society constrained and damaged women. His reaction to the Duke's treatment of her had been one of quiet outrage that spoke of a man who understood the true measure of honor. "They dare to invite you to celebrate their union," he said, his usually measured tone sharp with indignation. "The cruelty of it is breathtaking." "Which is precisely why I shall not attend," Evangeline replied, dipping her pen in ink to continue her refusal. "I have no desire to provide them with further opportunity for sport." "But perhaps," Aunt Agatha interjected thoughtfully, "that is exactly why you should attend. Not as the broken woman they expect to see, but as the accomplished, independent person you have become. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to remain defeated." Dr. Reed studied Evangeline's face with the careful attention he usually reserved for his most complex patients. "Your aunt speaks wisdom, though the choice must be entirely your own. I will say this, in the months I have known you, I have watched you transform from a woman who apologized for her very existence into someone who commands respect through her actions and character. If you choose to attend this ball, you would not go as a supplicant seeking their approval, but as their equal in every way that truly matters." The idea took root in Evangeline's mind, like a seed finding fertile ground. For months, she had been content to rebuild her life in the quiet sanctuary of Bath, but perhaps the time had come to step back into the larger world, not as the Duke's discarded bride, but as herself, complete and whole, and answerable to no one but her own conscience. "If I were to attend," she said slowly, "I would not go alone. Aunt Agatha, would you consider accompanying me? And Dr. Reed, the invitation extends to guests. Would you consent to serve as my escort?" The proposal hung in the air between them, charged with implications that went far beyond a simple social engagement. Dr. Reed's acceptance would mark him publicly as her particular friend, a declaration that would undoubtedly reach London society within days. For a man whose reputation and livelihood depended upon his professional standing, such an association with a woman of questionable social status represented a significant risk. "I would be honored," he replied without hesitation, his steady gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Though I confess I am more accustomed to the company of scholars and patients than dukes and duchesses." "Duke? Then you shall fit perfectly into our little party of social outcasts," Aunt Agatha declared with satisfaction. "Evangeline, my dear, if we are to make a proper impression, we must ensure that your appearance reflects the woman you have become rather than the girl you once were." The following weeks were spent in careful preparation. Aunt Agatha summoned Bath's finest dressmaker, a French émigré named Madame Dubois, who possessed an artist's eye for creating gowns that enhanced a woman's natural beauty while making subtle statements about her character. Together, they designed a dress that was both elegant and unconventional, deep sapphire silk that brought out the violet in Evangeline's eyes, cut in the latest fashion, but with unique details that spoke of confidence and independence. "The color is perfect," Madame Dubois declared during the final fitting, her expert hands adjusting the fall of the silk skirt. "It suggests both nobility and strength, tradition and innovation. You will be remembered, mademoiselle, but for all the right reasons." As the night of the ball approached, Evangeline found herself experiencing a curious mixture of anticipation and calm. The woman who had once trembled at the thought of social disapproval now felt only a quiet determination to face whatever awaited her with dignity and grace. Her work at the clinic had taught her that there were far worse things in life than gossip and social slights, and her growing friendship with Dr. Reed had shown her what it meant to be valued for her mind and character rather than her bloodline and dowry. The journey to Ashworth Manor took place on a clear winter evening when the stars seemed to hang like diamonds against the black velvet sky. Evangeline sat between Aunt Agatha and Dr. Reed in the hired carriage, drawing strength from their presence as the familiar landscape of her childhood rolled past the windows. The manor itself appeared gradually through the bare winter trees, its countless windows blazing with light and its grounds filled with the carriages of England's most distinguished families. "Remember," Aunt Agatha murmured, as their carriage joined the queue approaching the main entrance, "you are not here to seek their approval or to justify your choices. You are here to demonstrate that their opinion of you matters far less than your opinion of yourself." The great hall of Ashworth Manor had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with evergreen boughs and white roses creating an atmosphere of elegant festivity. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across the marble floors, and the air was filled with the sound of string music and refined conversation. Evangeline paused at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on Dr. Reed's arm, and surveyed the scene below with eyes that no longer sought acceptance but simply observed. The announcement of their arrival caused a ripple of recognition to spread through the assembled guests. Conversations paused, fans fluttered more rapidly, and heads turned to catch a glimpse of the woman who had once been the centre of London's greatest scandal. But instead of the broken creature they expected to see, they found a poised, elegant lady whose bearing spoke of quiet confidence and inner strength. "Lady Evangeline Fairfax," the butler announced in ringing tones, "Miss Agatha Worthington, and Dr. Elias Reed." Duke Reginald and Charlotte stood in the receiving line, resplendent in their roles as host and hostess. The Duke wore his formal evening attire with the same commanding presence that had once intimidated Evangeline, while Charlotte was magnificent in emerald silk that complemented her dark beauty. Yet, as Evangeline approached them, she noticed subtle signs of strain that had not been present during their triumphant wedding, a tightness around Charlotte's eyes, a forced quality to the Duke's smile. "Lady Evangeline," the Duke said, his voice carefully modulated to suggest gracious magnanimity. "How unexpected to see you here. I trust you have been well?" "Exceedingly well, Your Grace," Evangeline replied, her tone pleasant but cool. "I have discovered that life holds many more possibilities than I once imagined. May I present Dr. Reed? He has been instrumental in establishing medical services for Bath's less fortunate residents." The introduction was calculated to remind everyone present that while the Duke collected titles and properties, Evangeline had chosen to dedicate herself to meaningful work. Dr. Reed bowed with the dignity of a man secure in his own worth, his presence beside her making a statement that required no words. "How charitable," Charlotte said, her smile sharp as a blade. "Though I confess I'm surprised to find you in such unconventional company, cousin. I had heard you were living quite retired from society." "I have indeed been selective about my associations," Evangeline replied smoothly. "I find that quality matters far more than quantity when choosing one's companions." The barb hit its mark, and Charlotte's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly beneath her polished exterior. But before she could respond, other guests pressed forward to greet their hosts, and Evangeline was able to move into the ballroom proper. The evening that followed was a revelation. Instead of the whispered condemnation she had expected, Evangeline found herself surrounded by people eager to hear about her work in Bath, her travels with Aunt Agatha, and her thoughts on various social questions. Dr. Reed proved to be an ideal companion, intelligent, well-spoken, and clearly devoted to her welfare without being possessive or controlling. "You have caused quite a stir," he murmured, as they took their places for a country dance. "Half the room is trying to determine whether you are to be pitied or admired, while the other half seems genuinely interested in your transformation." "And what is your assessment, Dr. Reed?" Evangeline asked, allowing herself to enjoy the warmth in his eyes as they moved through the familiar steps. "I believe," he said quietly, "that you have become exactly who you were always meant to be. The Duke's rejection was not your failure. It was his loss, and his blindness to your true worth says far more about his character than yours." As the evening progressed, it became increasingly clear that the Duke and Charlotte's marriage was not the triumph it appeared to be. Evangeline observed their interactions with the detached interest of a natural philosopher studying an interesting specimen, noting the way Charlotte's laughter became more forced as the evening wore on, the manner in which the Duke's attention wandered to other women despite his wife's presence at his side. The revelation came during the supper interval, when Evangeline overheard a conversation between two elderly dowagers who had not noticed her approach. "Such a shame about the Ashworth marriage," one was saying to the other. "They say she has already spent through half her dowry on gowns and jewels, and he has returned to his old habits of gambling and other pursuits." "I heard," the second woman replied in conspiratorial tones, "that she discovered him in a compromising position with one of the housemaids just last week. The screaming could be heard throughout the servants' quarters." Evangeline felt no satisfaction at this intelligence, only a profound sadness for the choices that had led them all to this moment. The Duke had gained a wife who valued his title more than his character, while Charlotte had won a husband whose affections were as shallow as her own. They had achieved everything they thought they wanted, only to discover that their victory was hollow. But as she rejoined Dr. Reed and Aunt Agatha for the journey back to Bath, Evangeline realized that her own story was just beginning. The woman who had once defined herself by others' expectations had finally learned to value her own judgment, and the future stretched before her bright with possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. What new challenges and opportunities awaited a woman who had finally learned to trust her own heart? And how would her growing connection with Dr. Reed transform both their lives in ways neither had dared to dream? Spring arrived in Bath with an explosion of cherry blossoms that transformed the Georgian crescents into something from a fairy tale, their pink and white petals drifting like snow across the honey-coloured stone. Evangeline stood at the window of Aunt Agatha's morning room, watching the early sunlight paint the royal crescent in shades of gold and rose, and marvelled at how completely her life had changed in the year since her humiliation at the cathedral. The woman reflected in the glass bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had once trembled at the thought of social disapproval. The Morning Post brought news that would have once devastated her, but now merely confirmed what she had long suspected. Lady Pemberton, her former governess, wrote with barely concealed satisfaction about the spectacular collapse of the Duke and Charlotte's marriage. The Duke had been discovered in a series of increasingly scandalous affairs, while Charlotte had responded by conducting her own liaisons with a reckless abandon that had shocked even London's jaded society. Their public quarrels had become legendary, their separate residences a source of endless gossip, and their mutual recriminations had provided entertainment for the scandal sheets throughout the winter season. "Poor Charlotte," Evangeline murmured, though she felt more pity than satisfaction at her cousin's downfall. She achieved everything she thought she wanted, only to discover that a title without love is merely a beautiful prison. While you, Aunt Agatha observed, entering the room with her usual brisk energy, have discovered that freedom with purpose is worth more than all the duchies in England. Speaking of which, I believe Dr. Reed is expected this morning? He seemed quite eager to speak with you about something when he called yesterday. Indeed, Elias had requested a private audience, his usual composed demeanour betraying an excitement that had intrigued Evangeline throughout their brief conversation the previous day. Their relationship had evolved over the months into something deeper and more complex than friendship, though neither had yet spoken openly of the feelings that had grown between them like flowers reaching toward sunlight. He arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, as was his habit, but instead of his usual medical bag, he carried a leather portfolio that he clutched with the nervous energy of a man about to take a momentous step. Evangeline received him in the small parlour overlooking the garden, where the morning light streaming through the tall windows created an atmosphere of intimate warmth. "Evangeline," he began, then stopped, running his hand through his auburn hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of deep emotion. "Forgive me, but I find myself quite unable to approach this conversation with my usual professional composure." "Then perhaps," she suggested gently, settling into her favorite chair and gesturing for him to join her, "you might simply speak from your heart rather than your head. I have found that the most important truths are often the simplest ones." He took a deep breath and opened the portfolio, revealing a collection of official-looking documents and what appeared to be architectural drawings. "I have been offered a position," he said, his green eyes bright with excitement and uncertainty. "The Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh has invited me to establish a new teaching hospital, one dedicated specifically to training doctors in the treatment of women's ailments and the medical needs of the poor." Evangeline felt her heart leap with genuine joy for his achievement, even as a small part of her recognized the implications of his news. Edinburgh was hundreds of miles from Bath, a different world entirely from the comfortable life she had built in Aunt Agatha's household. "Elias, that is wonderful," she exclaimed, her pleasure in his success overriding any personal concerns. "You have worked so hard for such recognition, and the opportunity to train other physicians in your methods could help countless people." "Yes," he agreed, but his expression remained troubled. "The position would allow me to implement all the reforms I have dreamed of: proper medical education for women, clinics that serve patients regardless of their ability to pay, research into the diseases that particularly affect the poor. It is everything I have worked toward." "But," Evangeline prompted, sensing the hesitation beneath his excitement, "but I find myself reluctant to accept an opportunity that would take me away from Bath," he said quietly. "Away from the work we have built together, away from your aunt's salon and the life I have come to treasure here. Away from you." The words hung in the air between them, charged with all the feelings they had carefully avoided naming. Evangeline felt her cheeks warm as she met his gaze, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that she felt in her own heart. "Elias," she said softly, "you cannot refuse such an opportunity for my sake. Your work is too important, your vision too valuable to be constrained by personal considerations." "Cannot I?" he asked, leaning forward in his chair with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Evangeline, these past months have shown me that professional achievement means nothing without someone to share it with, someone who understands not just what I do, but why I do it. You have become essential to my happiness in ways I never thought possible." Before she could respond, he slid from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that spoke of reverence rather than mere affection. "I know I have little to offer compared to the dukes and earls who once sought your hand. I am not wealthy, my title is earned rather than inherited, and my work will always take me among the poor and suffering rather than the powerful and privileged. But I love you, Evangeline, with a devotion that grows stronger every day, and I cannot imagine a future that does not include you by my side." Evangeline felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Here was a man who valued her mind as much as her beauty, who had seen her at her lowest point and helped her discover her own strength, who offered her not a cage of golden expectations, but a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Oh, Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "do you truly believe I would choose wealth and title over love and purpose? I have learned the difference between a life lived for others' approval and a life lived according to one's own values. If you will have me, I would be honored to be your wife, your partner in all things." His kiss was gentle and reverent, a seal upon promises spoken and unspoken. When they finally drew apart, both were laughing through their tears, giddy with the joy of acknowledged love and the prospect of a shared future. "Then you will come with me to Edinburgh?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder at her acceptance. "I will go anywhere with you," she replied, "but more than that, I want to be part of your work, your mission. I have discovered that I have a talent for organizing, for managing the practical details that allow healing to happen. Let me help you build this hospital. Let me be your true partner in creating something that will outlast us both." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and planning. Aunt Agatha threw herself into the arrangements with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign, declaring that she had always wanted to see Scotland and would certainly accompany them to Edinburgh to ensure that Evangeline was properly established in her new life. "Besides," she added with a mischievous smile, "I have heard that Edinburgh's intellectual society is quite stimulating. Perhaps I shall find new subjects for my writing, new minds to challenge my own assumptions." The wedding was planned for early summer, a small ceremony in Bath Abbey that would reflect their values rather than their social status. Dr. Reed's colleagues from the medical community would attend alongside Aunt Agatha's circle of reformers and intellectuals, creating a gathering that celebrated achievement and character rather than bloodline and wealth. But even as Evangeline threw herself into preparations for her new life, she could not entirely escape the shadows of her past. News from London continued to arrive with disturbing regularity, painting an increasingly dark picture of the Duke and Charlotte's deteriorating situation. The Duke's gambling debts had reached catastrophic proportions, while Charlotte's desperate attempts to maintain her social position had led her into increasingly questionable associations. The final revelation came in a letter from Lady Pemberton, written in the breathless tones of someone who could barely contain her excitement at having such scandalous news to share. The Duke had been discovered in a compromising position with the wife of a prominent member of Parliament, leading to a duel that had left him wounded and disgraced. Charlotte, meanwhile, had been caught attempting to sell family jewels to pay for her mounting debts, a discovery that had finally prompted the Ashworth family to take decisive action. "They are to be separated," Evangeline read aloud to Aunt Agatha and Elias as they sat in the garden on a warm May evening. "The Duke is to be sent to his estates in Ireland, while Charlotte is to retire to a cottage in the countryside under the supervision of his mother. Their marriage, it seems, has become too scandalous even for London society to tolerate." A cautionary tale, Aunt Agatha observed, about the dangers of choosing ambition over affection, appearance over authenticity. Elias reached for Evangeline's hand, his touch warm and reassuring in the gathering dusk. "I confess I feel pity for them both," he said quietly. "They achieved everything they thought they wanted, only to discover that their victory was hollow. How different their story might have been if they had learned to value character over status, love over advantage." "Perhaps," Evangeline replied, "their tragedy was necessary for my transformation. If the Duke had not rejected me so publicly, I might never have discovered my own strength, never have found my true purpose. In trying to destroy me, he actually freed me to become who I was always meant to be." As the summer wedding approached, Evangeline found herself reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken. The woman who had once measured her worth by others' approval had learned to trust her own judgment. The girl who had trembled at the thought of social disapproval had discovered that there were far more important things than the opinions of people who valued appearance over substance. On the morning of her wedding, as she stood before the mirror in her simple but elegant gown of cream silk, Evangeline saw not a bride seeking validation, but a woman choosing her own destiny. The ceremony would be small and intimate, witnessed by people who valued love over lineage, but it would be infinitely more meaningful than the grand spectacle that had been planned for her union with the Duke. "Are you ready, my dear?" Aunt Agatha asked, entering the room with tears of joy in her eyes. "I have never been more ready for anything in my life," Evangeline replied, and meant every word. But as she prepared to walk down the aisle toward the man who had seen her true worth when she could not see it herself, Evangeline could not have known that her story would inspire other women to question their own predetermined paths, or that the hospital she and Elias would build together would become a beacon of hope for generations of patients who had previously been ignored by the medical establishment. What new adventures awaited a woman who had finally learned to trust her own heart? And how would her partnership with Elias transform not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who would benefit from their shared vision of healing and hope? The Scottish Highlands stretched endlessly beyond the windows of Evangeline's study, their purple heather and emerald valleys creating a tapestry of wild beauty that never failed to inspire her as she worked at her mahogany desk. 2 years had passed since she and Elias had arrived in Edinburgh as newlyweds, their hearts full of dreams and their minds buzzing with plans for the revolutionary medical institution they intended to create. Now, as autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, those dreams had taken tangible form in the imposing stone structure that rose from the hillside overlooking the city, the Reed Institute for Medical Innovation and Women's Health. Evangeline set down her pen and flexed her fingers, cramped from hours of correspondence with potential donors, government officials, and medical colleagues across Europe. The morning's work had included letters to 3 prominent London physicians who had expressed interest in joining their faculty, a detailed proposal to the Royal College for expanding their research into maternal mortality, and a carefully worded response to a scathing editorial in the Times that had questioned the propriety of allowing women to study medicine alongside men. "Still fighting the good fight, I see," Elias observed, entering the study with 2 cups of tea and the satisfied expression of a man who had just completed a successful surgery. His auburn hair was slightly disheveled, and his sleeves were rolled up in the practical manner of someone who valued function over form, details that made Evangeline's heart flutter just as they had during their courtship in Bath. "Doctor, Pemberton has written from London," Evangeline replied, accepting the tea gratefully and gesturing toward the letter that had arrived with the morning post. 3 more young women have applied for admission to our nursing program, including the daughter of a prominent barrister who has threatened to disown her if she pursues such an unseemly profession. Elias settled into the chair beside her desk, his green eyes bright with the passion that had first drawn her to him. "And what did you tell her?" "That we would be honored to have her, naturally," Evangeline said with a smile that held just a hint of mischief. "I also suggested that she might find it illuminating to correspond with Miss Sarah Whitmore, who graduated from our first class and is now establishing a clinic for working women in Manchester. Sometimes the best argument for women's capabilities is simply demonstrating them." The Reed Institute had become far more than either of them had originally envisioned. What had begun as a modest teaching hospital had evolved into a comprehensive center for medical education, research, and social reform. The main building housed not only modern surgical theaters and patient wards, but also lecture halls where women studied alongside men, laboratories where groundbreaking research into infectious diseases was conducted, and consultation rooms where patients received care regardless of their ability to pay. But perhaps most revolutionary of all was the Institute's approach to treating women's health concerns. Under Elias's guidance, a new generation of physicians was learning to view women's ailments as legitimate medical conditions rather than manifestations of moral weakness or hysteria. Evangeline had established a comprehensive program for training female nurses and midwives, creating opportunities for women to enter the medical profession in roles that utilized their natural compassion while demanding rigorous scientific education. "I received interesting news from London as well," Elias said, producing a letter bearing the seal of the Royal College of Physicians. "They have formally invited me to present our research on puerperal fever at their annual conference. It seems our mortality rates have attracted attention even among the most conservative members of the medical establishment." Evangeline felt a surge of pride at his achievement, though she was not surprised by the recognition. Their collaborative approach to medical care, combining Elias's surgical expertise with her organizational skills and deep understanding of women's experiences, had produced results that spoke for themselves. The Institute's maternal mortality rate was less than half that of comparable institutions, while their success in treating diseases that disproportionately affected the poor had earned them praise from social reformers across Britain. "Will you accept?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Elias had never been one to shy away from opportunities to advance their cause, even when it meant facing skeptical or hostile audiences. "How can I refuse?" he replied with a grin that reminded her of the earnest young physician she had first met in Aunt Agatha's parlour. "Though I confess I would prefer to have you beside me when I present our findings. Your insights into the social factors that affect women's health have been crucial to our success." The suggestion was both thrilling and impossible. While Evangeline had become an acknowledged expert in hospital administration and women's health advocacy, the Royal College remained steadfastly male in its membership and traditions. Her presence at such a gathering would cause a scandal that might undermine the very reforms they sought to promote. "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "there are other ways to ensure that women's voices are heard in these discussions. Miss Whitmore has been documenting her experiences in Manchester, and Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell has written extensively about her work in America. What if we were to compile their observations, along with our own data, into a comprehensive report that could be distributed to conference attendees?" Elias's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "A collaborative work that demonstrates the breadth and depth of women's contributions to medical knowledge. Evangeline, you are brilliant. Such a publication would be impossible to ignore, even by the most traditional physicians." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the study door, followed by the entrance of Mrs. MacLeod, the Institute's head housekeeper, whose efficient management of the domestic staff had freed Evangeline to focus on larger administrative concerns. "Begging your pardon, Dr. and Mrs. Reed," she said in her melodious Highland accent, "but there's a lady arrived who insists on speaking with you both. She says she's travelled from London on a matter of great urgency." Evangeline and Elias exchanged curious glances. Unexpected visitors were not uncommon. Their reputation had spread far beyond Scotland, attracting patients, students and reformers from across Europe, but few arrived without prior correspondence. "Did she give her name?" Evangeline asked, already rising from her chair and smoothing her practical wool dress. "Lady Charlotte Ashworth, ma'am," Mrs. MacLeod replied, her expression carefully neutral, though she seems somewhat distressed. The name hit Evangeline like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories she had thought safely buried in the past. Charlotte, her cousin, her betrayer, the woman who had stolen her intended husband and then watched their marriage crumble into scandal and recrimination. What could possibly have brought her to Scotland? to the doorstep of the woman she had so publicly humiliated. Elias reached for Evangeline's hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "You need not see her if you prefer not to," he said quietly. "I can speak with her alone, or we can ask her to leave." And beige, but even as part of Evangeline recoiled from the prospect of facing Charlotte again, her curiosity was stronger than her reluctance. The woman who had once been so confident, so certain of her own superiority, was apparently in distress. What circumstances could have reduced the triumphant Duchess to seeking help from the cousin she had betrayed? "No," Evangeline said, squaring her shoulders with the resolve that had carried her through 2 years of challenging work. "I will see her. Whatever has brought her here, she has traveled a long way. The least I can do is listen to what she has to say." They found Charlotte in the Institute's main reception hall, a grand space designed to impress visitors with its soaring ceilings and modern medical equipment displayed behind glass cases. But the woman who stood with her back to them, staring out at the Highland landscape, bore little resemblance to the confident beauty who had stolen Evangeline's bridegroom. Charlotte's travelling dress, while still fashionable, showed signs of wear and hasty packing. Her dark hair, once perfectly arranged, was dishevelled from her journey, and when she turned to face them, Evangeline was shocked to see how much she had aged in just 2 years. "Evangeline," Charlotte said, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for seeing me. I was not certain you would." "Charlotte." Evangeline's tone was carefully neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. "This is my husband, Dr. Elias Reed. You said you had urgent business to discuss." Charlotte's gaze flickered to Elias, taking in his obvious devotion to his wife and the quiet strength that radiated from his bearing. "Dr. Reed, your reputation precedes you. I have heard remarkable things about the work you and Evangeline have accomplished here." "Thank you," Elias replied politely, though his protective instincts were clearly aroused by Charlotte's presence. "Perhaps we might retire to a more private setting for this conversation." They settled in Evangeline's office, a comfortable room lined with medical texts and decorated with watercolours of Scottish wildflowers that Aunt Agatha had painted during her extended visit the previous summer. Charlotte perched on the edge of her chair like a bird ready to take flight, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I suppose you have heard about my circumstances," Charlotte began, her voice thick with shame. "The separation, the scandal, the complete destruction of everything I thought I wanted." "We heard something of it," Evangeline replied carefully. "I confess I felt more pity than satisfaction at the news." Charlotte's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "Pity? Yes, I suppose that is what I deserve. I achieved everything I thought I wanted, the title, the wealth, the social position, only to discover that I had married a man who was incapable of fidelity or genuine affection. Reginald saw me as nothing more than an ornament, a beautiful object to display when it suited his purposes and ignore when it did not." "I am sorry for your suffering," Evangeline said, and meant it. Whatever Charlotte had done, the pain in her voice was genuine and heartbreaking. "Are you?" Charlotte asked, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Even after what I did to you, even after I stole your bridegroom and humiliated you before all of London society?" Evangeline considered the question carefully, examining her own heart for traces of the anger and resentment that had once consumed her. "I was devastated at the time," she said honestly, "but I have come to understand that you did me a tremendous favor, though I doubt that was your intention. If you had not intervened, I would have married a man who was fundamentally unsuited to me, and I would never have discovered my own strength or found my true purpose." "Your true purpose," Charlotte repeated, her gaze moving around the office with its evidence of meaningful work and genuine accomplishment. "Yes, I can see that you have found something far more valuable than anything Reginald could have offered you. You have built a life of substance, of real meaning." "We have built it together," Evangeline corrected, glancing at Elias with a smile that spoke of deep contentment. But you still have not told us why you have come here. Charlotte took a shaky breath, her composure finally cracking completely. Because I am with child, she whispered, and I have nowhere else to turn. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Evangeline felt her heart clench with sympathy for her cousin's predicament, while Elias leaned forward with the professional concern of a physician confronted with a patient in need. The child is not Reginald's, Charlotte continued, her voice barely audible. Our marriage was troubled from the beginning, and we have not shared a bed in over a year. When I discovered my condition, I knew that revealing it would mean complete social ruin, not just for me, but for the innocent child I carry. And the father? Elias asked gently, his medical training overriding any personal feelings about Charlotte's past behavior. A man who cannot acknowledge the child without destroying his own family, Charlotte replied, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I have been living in hiding for the past 3 months, but my condition will soon become impossible to conceal. I heard about your work here, about the way you help women regardless of their circumstances, and I hoped... You hoped we might help you? Evangeline finished, her heart already softening toward the desperate woman before her. Charlotte, you must understand that what you are asking... I am not asking for forgiveness, Charlotte interrupted, her voice gaining strength. I know I have no right to that. I'm asking for mercy, for the sake of an innocent child who deserves a chance at life, regardless of the circumstances of its conception. Evangeline looked at Elias, seeing in his eyes the same compassion that had first drawn her to him. They had built the institute on the principle that healing should be available to all who needed it, regardless of their social status or past mistakes. How could they turn away a woman in desperate need, even one who had once caused them both such pain? Of course we will help you, Evangeline said quietly. You can stay here until the child is born, and we will ensure that you receive the best possible care. After that, well, we can discuss your options when the time comes. Charlotte's relief was so profound that she nearly collapsed, her carefully maintained composure finally giving way to grateful sobs. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you both. I know I have no right to your kindness, but I swear I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it. As the weeks passed, Charlotte's presence at the Institute created an unexpected dynamic that challenged everyone involved to examine their own capacity for forgiveness and growth. The woman who had once been so proud and calculating proved to be genuinely remorseful for her past actions, and her gratitude for the sanctuary she had been offered was both touching and transformative. Under Evangeline's guidance, Charlotte began to assist with the Institute's charitable work, her natural intelligence and organizational skills proving valuable in managing the complex logistics of caring for Edinburgh's poorest residents. She worked with quiet determination, never complaining about tasks that would once have been beneath her notice, and gradually earned the respect of the staff and patients who had initially viewed her with suspicion. She has changed, Elias observed one evening as he and Evangeline walked through the Institute's gardens, watching Charlotte read stories to a group of children whose mothers were receiving treatment in the women's ward. Suffering has taught her empathy in a way that privilege never could. Perhaps, Evangeline replied thoughtfully, redemption is possible for all of us, if we are willing to acknowledge our mistakes and work to make amends. Charlotte's presence here has reminded me that forgiveness is not about forgetting the past, but about choosing to focus on the future we can build together. When Charlotte's son was born on a snowy December morning, he entered the world surrounded by love and hope rather than shame and secrecy. Evangeline held the tiny infant while Charlotte recovered from her labor, marveling at the perfect innocence of new life and the way it could transform even the most complicated relationships. "What will you name him?" Evangeline asked as she placed the baby in his mother's arms. "James," Charlotte replied, her voice soft with wonder as she gazed at her son's face. "After my grandfather, who always believed that people could change if they truly wanted to." and his middle name will be Elias, if Dr. Reed will permit it, in honor of the man who showed me what true nobility looks like. As Evangeline watched Charlotte cradle her child, she reflected on the strange turns that life could take. The woman who had once been her greatest enemy had become, if not a friend, then at least a fellow traveler on the difficult path toward redemption and self-discovery. The Institute had given Charlotte not just sanctuary, but purpose, while her presence had reminded everyone there that healing came in many forms. But perhaps most importantly, Charlotte's transformation had demonstrated the truth that Evangeline and Elias had built their lives around, that every person deserved the chance to grow, to change, and to contribute something meaningful to the world. In choosing compassion over revenge, forgiveness over resentment, they had not only saved Charlotte and her child, but had also affirmed the principles that made their work truly revolutionary. As the Scottish winter deepened around them, the Reed Institute stood as a beacon of hope and healing, its lights shining out across the Highland landscape like stars in the darkness. And within its walls, 3 people who had once been bound by betrayal and pain had discovered that love, properly understood, was not a finite resource to be hoarded, but an infinite wellspring that grew stronger when shared with others. What new challenges and triumphs awaited them in the years to come, and how would their example inspire others to choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair? And so ends the remarkable journey of Lady Evangeline Fairfax, who discovered that true nobility comes not from titles or bloodlines, but from the courage to forge one's own path and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose. Her story reminds us that our greatest defeats can become our most profound victories, and that the love we choose is always more powerful than the love that is chosen for us. If this tale of resilience, redemption, and the triumph of authentic love over shallow ambition has moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more stories of remarkable women who refuse to be defined by others' expectations. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment in Evangeline's journey resonated most deeply with you? And don't forget to like this video to help us reach others who might need to hear that their worth is not determined by society's approval, but by their own courage to live authentically. Until our next story, remember that you too have the power to bloom wherever you are planted, to transform your trials into triumphs, and to write your own ending regardless of how your story began.